Richard Peiser has been the Michael D. Spear Professor of Real Estate Development at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University since 1998. He's also a director of the university-wide Real Estate Academic Initiative created in 2003. Rick's primary research has focused on developing an understanding of the response of the real estate developers to the marketplace and to the institutional environment in which they operate, particularly in the areas of urban redevelopment, affordable housing, and suburban sprawl. He received his BA from Yale, an MBA from the Harvard Business School, and a PhD from the University of Cambridge. Rick Peiser, thank you for joining us from up in Massachusetts. We're so honored that you took the time to spend this time with us today.
Well, Dave, thank you so much. It's an honor for me to be here.
As we look past this past year, you look over this pandemic period, this COVID-19 period, my first question for you is to ask you to articulate what you believe the lessons observed were. What did you observe over this period of time that might be lessons that, whether we as a profession or as a built environment industry, which includes all of real estate and maybe the greater society, lessons that we've observed and maybe adopted during this period?
Well, that's a huge question, but in short, I'd say the first lesson, at least for me, and just looking out across the field, has been adaptability. I think we've actually adjusted better and faster than I feared when this got started. I admit when I was first inconvenienced by the possibility of the pandemic, I was thinking in terms of, okay, I can stop doing what I was for 10 days. It will be a little break. And then when 10 days stretched into 4 weeks, and then as it slowly became clear that this was going to be a very long-term shutdown that would have implications for everything, it was only then that I and I think many of my peers started to really reassess their behavior. And there are changes, throughout everything we do. But specifically about real estate, for me, probably the biggest change, which is going to take years to play out, is what I would call the return to suburbia. I actually got my start as an academic writing on the subject of urban sprawl. And I have witnessed and been, as an urban planner, very pleased with what I might summarize as a return to the city movement, which is the excitement and the reinvestment in cities and cities being the place that people wanted to be, to have that 24-hour environment. And it's not a surprise that the major high-tech firms and life science firms, all those, the growth industries in the United States that capitalize on the intellectual property that you find around universities and in cities, that was driving the broad scale location movements within the United States. And I think, sadly, the return to the city movement has not only had a big hiccup, but I think we're going to see a major shift that is already starting to take place, but it's one that will show up in the data and demographic movements, some of which we won't even see for 10 years. But this is being played out in so many ways. But first and foremost is a recognition by many office workers that they can be just as productive and lead a lifestyle that they may prefer back at home. And that has been feeding a burst of activity and reinvestment in the suburbs and exurbs. So I think, as almost anybody in any major city knows, if you're trying to buy a house right now for yourself or a child, And looking out in popular suburban communities, it's a shock. Prices are up 10 to 20% over a year ago. There's many bidders on properties. As a small example, we decided in November to buy a house with our daughter in Marblehead, which is a very pretty suburb north of Boston. We looked one weekend, we actually found a property that was attractive and started bidding on it. We did a full price offer. We're told fairly quickly if we had stood a chance, we had to bid something higher. We were given no indication of what higher was, but I decided, well, this was an attractive, inexpensive property for Marblehead, so we did bid 5% over the asking price. There was a bid that was 10%, but they hadn't come in to look at the property, so we were able to get it at that. And I've heard so many stories of bidding wars that are going on around the country. Now, some of that may be short-lived because of various shortages in lumber and even cars. Where we're paying $100 a day to rent a car at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport that I used to get for $9 a day. Yeah. But I think these are major shifts that are not going to turn around anytime soon, and that has huge implications across the board for retail, for office, and industrial. I can speak to that about each of the property types, but let me pause and see, give it back to you a moment.
Well, thank you. I hear what you're saying. I guess I continue to believe in the urban experience, and that we will, of course, we'll go through this transitional period where, like a pendulum that swings all the way out here, and now the pendulum is swung all the way here. My guess is it's going to come back, but probably not all the way. Maybe we'll find this moderation someplace in the middle of urban dwellers wanting to move back into the cities, but being much more conscious of the idea of healthiness and safety and resilience on many aspects of our lives. And of course, my guess is that the urban environment price points may actually come down while the suburbans are going through the roof. Perhaps we'll see a bit of a lowering that will attract some new buyers, some younger buyers, the potentially to bring a new breath of freshness and youth back to our urban environments. That's number one is point or observation. The second is, as you know, because of your work around the world with Urban Land Institute and through the Harvard Real Estate Program and the other organizations that you support with your work, the promise of smart cities continues to be somewhat elusive here in the United States. We're watching it almost in a science fiction way over in China. Other cities around the world are much more advanced in their thinking. Will we see, quote unquote, smart cities in the United States sometime in the next 10, 15 years that will also serve as a mitigation of this type of pandemic dynamic in the future? And I don't know if people are even thinking about how those things go together at this point. Some thoughts?
Well, I don't think the very notion of smart city has any set definition, because when I think about a smart city, there are different elements. I don't think we're going to see the kinds of smart city associated monitoring that has worked very successfully in China, where, for example, people have green passes to gain entry into buildings. Well, let me leave that out there. I think that's something that we may start to see. Harvard, for example, is requiring vaccinations, and how exactly they're going to monitor that, I'm not so sure. But I do think what the pandemic has very much exposed is this dichotomy of American sense of liberty versus some of the what should be obvious measures for public safety and public health that many other societies have adopted. Now, on other levels where the U.S. is clearly dragging, and this goes back to public transportation, the notion of complete streets, things that might be considered monitoring devices, but are also mechanisms that really promote wider utilization of our urban environments. I think we're going to continue to see a lot of advances there. But here, once again, COVID gets in the way, because I think we're going to see a significant shift away from public transportation back to the private automobile for health reasons. The U.S. is already, except in a very small handful of cities, very weak on the public transportation side, and I don't think COVID is helping out there. No. Now, having said that, there's enormous progress being made in prop tech, and I think the pressure to move toward energy efficient buildings and toward both materials and heating mechanisms and air conditioning mechanisms that reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. The U.S. is not leading there. At least I think it's gaining in importance on our own agenda. And I do expect to see a lot of advances there and a lot of changes that will mean for where people want to live. One of the topics we're trying to research now is to the extent to which office tenants are willing to pay the premium necessary to cover various changes in the building design and building systems. And the jury's actually out on that. One would think that the answer is yes, that people are willing to pay the freight. At a certain level, with the greater attention to ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues, and that's certainly higher on certain agendas. Well, these things are going to have major impact, I think, going forward on what the on how quickly cities adapt to the future. Having said that, I am not at all optimistic that we are ahead of the curve. We're not even recognizing the curve on the environmental consequences of climate change. And even though it's starting to hit us in the face with the wildfires, we got our insurance policy in Laguna Beach was canceled. We finally found a replacement at double the cost. We're doing a lot of research in hurricane-prone areas that up until now have not felt any of the economic consequences of being in a higher risk zone. That's going to change. And I think there are major questions ahead as to how much money do you reinvest in keeping Miami Beach above the water? They're going to make it another 20, 50 years, but at some point, people are going to, that storm will come along, create such major damage, and leave a ghost town in its wake. One has to start thinking ahead as to what really is going to happen in the long run.
I read a report this weekend that was released by the National Director of Intelligence for the United States, and it gave the 2021 threat assessment against the United States. And of course, it had the typical players on there as far as other nationals. But what was so interesting in the report and central to the report was the national threat of climate change, considered as a national security threat. Isn't that interesting? We finally made it to the front page. A bit late. But yes. What you're talking about is definitely, it's not just private property threat. This creates such a pebble in pond effect that ruminates across the surface of our nation that creates all kinds of potential unrest when we lose out in this climate, this war on climate. Let's go back a bit and talk about some of these markets. We talked about in commercial real estate, we think about the office environment that's just been slapped down hard, and we think of the major shift that's occurred to online retail and what's happening there. What are we looking at in the coming year or two from your perspective in these two markets?
Well, the big message I would convey is that I think the disruption and change that we've seen the last 2 years, it is like your pendulum. It is going to swing back the other way. This is neither the death of office nor the death of retail. First, on the retail, there's no question that the pandemic accelerated things that were happening in the market already. When I first came to Harvard in 1998, I was working on research about the graying of America's malls, in which the regional malls at the time, there were 2,800, and the prediction was that number would go over time to 1,400. And today the projections are that when all is said and done, that it will be about 350 A-plus malls left. So these changes have been going on for a long time, and what the pandemic did was accelerated that process. But people are so eager to be back. Going back to your comment, this is hardly the death of urban areas. In fact, we're going to see this wonderful rebirth because everybody wants to be back in those areas. I was down on Newbury Street last week, and it was just packed, and everybody is loving to be outside. Now, so we did see a big jump in online retail sales, and I think everybody's made adjustments to what they're able to do online. But we're already seeing that peak in online sales starting to come back. Now, it's not going to come back. I hate to quote numbers because they're definitely wrong, but I've seen numbers that online sales peaked at about 20% in the US, and that beforehand they were about in the 12 to 14% range, and that it will settle somewhere back in the 16% range. But that's still, that's not even a majority of online sales. I mean, a majority of sales. So as big as everybody thinks it is, it's not the end of retailing as we know it. We could talk a lot about successful retailing, but the multi-channel stores that have brick and mortar, online distribution, they have curbside pickup. The retailers are very inventive, and I think are adapting quickly. And retail is definitely changing, but it's not dying in any sense of the word. And I'd say the same for office. You probably didn't want to own a Class B or C downtown office building now because it's probably vacant and may not get reoccupied. Right. But the newer Class A offices, wherever they are, I think are going to do just fine. And I had friends who were buying suburban office buildings at depressed prices 2 years ago. Those deals dried up a year ago, and today they're just wishing they bought more, because I think we're starting to see this return to suburbia. Now, the types of offices are going to be very different, and we did a report for NAIOP 2 or 3 years ago about all the amenities that are going into new office buildings. And once again, offices like retail have been changing quite dramatically over the last decade. The pandemic is accelerating those changes, but I'm not predicting that everybody's going to be working from home henceforth.
We're watching a pretty much of a trend over this period of time that is probably going to range somewhere between 20 and 30%, may stay in a permanent 30% of the workforce may stay in a permanent type of hybrid, where they work part of the time from office and part of the time from home or anywhere else at the end of the day. I think instead of calling it work from home, we're calling it work from anywhere at the end of the day. But there are such cultural implications to having 100% virtual workforce. And think that we're really understanding what that means, having been in this context. And so the need for people to be with people is essential. But do we need to bring 100% of the people back to 100% of the seats 100% of the time? Probably not. And so
no, definitely not. And I think people are recognizing they actually work more efficiently for many things if they're not commuting an hour a day each way or something. But there's opposing forces resulting from that. On the one hand, you don't need as many offices, and there is a definite downsizing of office space that has been going on since well before the pandemic. But one big switch we're about to see is that this push to have smaller and smaller offices, more hot desking, less space per employee. That, I think, is going to turn around, and that we're going to see more private offices, more less areas where you just see a sea of open desks with 6-foot walls, not only because they're kind of ugly and oppressive places to work, but people are seeing that many of the people who worked in those jobs were just as efficient at home. So that's going to mean that the offices that are built, we're going to see more space per employee. And so on one hand, we have downsizing of office overall, but as space per employee increases, that means the net demand for office is not going to drop quite as much and as quickly as it might have.
At DesignIntelligence, we believe that equity, healthiness, and the environment are inextricably linked. They go together. Right. And yet the design community, maybe the overall built environment community as a global industry, has not had that as a front of mind consciousness in the work that we do. I think there are many who will design and build green spaces, but maybe not so equitable. Maybe folks who are focused on equity that don't think about healthiness. The question is how do we bring all three of those perspectives front of mind all the time in all the projects? Now, knowing that you are someone who has worked with the owner community, the owner and investor community for many, many years, I'm convinced that as much as the design community may desire this, at the end of the day, this is going to come down to a conviction of the owners. Do I want to put this into my space or not? And my sense is that what's happening socially in the world right now, we're either going to move to a more regulated forcing of that, or we're going to move to a wholesale, because of demographic changes, a new set of priorities and values that will drive to that. And I guess there's probably someplace in between a little bit more demonstrative regulatory pressure toward doing what is right and the volunteer adoption of doing what is right, coming together in a nice place. But I guess I'd like to hear from you on what your thoughts are about that, and how do we create a larger conversation between the owners and all of the other stakeholders that support those owner projects toward this more equitable, healthy, environmentally responsible future?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head as to what our challenge and charge is, both in the academy and in the industry. So far, I think there's been more lip service to these issues than actual progress. And I think you're exactly right that it will be a combination of societal pressure reacting to all these forces that we've been living through with the pandemic and climate change, but also politically, which I have to say is scary. There are things happening in the United States that I never would have dreamed of. But just speaking from the owner's perspective, well, to be candid, I think the majority of owners have preferred to hide their head in the sand on this. but they won't be able to anymore. Certainly on the environment, I mean, that's been kind of front and center for a long time, and there's just clear dollars and cents reasons to do things that are sensible with respect to building design and building efficiency that reduce energy. And there's similarly a kind of an imperative on healthy buildings, just in the sense if you want to rent your building, then there are certain standards that you need to achieve that were not what you would have done in the 60s or 70s or 80s era office building, or the design of a retail center. People like that open air. There are things that appeal to them in their design that also turn out to be what we should be doing properly in terms of promoting healthy buildings and more environmentally conscious buildings. I see the hardest area is on the equity and social front. And there, unfortunately, every regulation we pass increases the cost of housing and basically makes it harder for us to do anything that starts to reverse this richer getting richer and poor getting poorer situation in the U.S. Now, having said that, housing is so different if you're in the middle of the country versus on the coast. And I think the issues that we face in Boston and San Francisco and San Diego is not that way where I grew up in Dallas, where there are really no constraints on how far the city can go. And I guess the land itself is not viewed as, what we used to call ball-ass Texas prairie is not the same as redwood studded hills in Northern California. But, we're still going to run out of land. So I think even in Texas, where you do not see as much concern about any of these issues as you do in some of the coastal states, that the changes will still be occurring, albeit at a slower rate. Still, I'm optimistic that we're going to be heading in that direction. Just coming back to the social dimension, though, which is so front and center in the universities. Every discussion, every committee, every hiring is through the lens of social equity. And while I don't think that has permeated yet down to most building owners, I think it's inevitably going to increase. It's certainly a much more important topic at the organizations like the Urban Land Institute, where it's something you're talking about on virtually every program. So I think this awareness about social equity issues and how that ultimately, on the one hand, is so closely related to demographic change in the United States, but it has to do with opportunity for education, opportunity for advancement, and ultimately just a society that functions more smoothly in a fairer manner. Now, just when you think about the big picture issues, the United States is not set up in a way like many of the, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, even Germany, the countries that are comparable in terms of wealth and GDP, but seem to have a much more equitable taxation system where you don't have the enormous disparities that we do. And of course, we see the benefits of that in terms of more rapid innovation in some respects, but also the price of that in a very dichotomized society. So, these are huge questions that I'm afraid I don't have any easy answers to, but I do think that we're going to continue to see more rapid awareness and more change by building owners and throughout the industry.
Yeah. We're watching a significant emphasis on what I call essential infrastructure, starting to rise as a discussion. Of course, it's been around a while, but with the president's, newest proposal of a couple of $1 trillion toward primarily infrastructure, and I'm talking roads and bridges and electrical grids and water systems, et cetera. Let us pretend that the majority of that makes it through the Congress. What is our prediction and of the implications that will have to the what we'll call above the ground implications to the built environment if it indeed passes? And will there be this consciousness toward equity, healthiness, and sustainability when we think of essential infrastructure? Not something that often is talked about.
No, it's not talked about, but I think it's a source of my optimism for the future. I hope that this doesn't just go down the tubes as other infrastructure bills have. I know there's bipartisan support, but this is the United States' real Achilles heel. I mean, if there is an advantage of living in a communist or dictatorial governance situation, is that if you go to China and see what they've done in terms of rapid rail at the airports, just the speed of urban, not just urban construction, but also urban innovation and putting in smart city types of changes. It's getting done in the countries that are major competitors, and it's giving them advantages that if we're going to compete, it has to happen here. I mean, you just think of the amount of time lost, the money wasted when you have a bridge collapse or have lane closures. Well, not to bring this back to home, but PCH in Laguna Beach they're now doing major work on that. And what used to be, a 10-minute ride to get through town, today you can't do it in less than a half an hour. I mean, it just changes patterns, and you multiply that throughout the country of the simple things that just go back. It's not just about reinvestment in infrastructure. It's where a country or a company or a person saves when they're running short of cash. You don't repair the roof, you don't fix the road, right. And those things come back to haunt you. And now we're well down that path, and that much more in need of paying the price. Now, I think we both agree on the need. If it happens the way we think it should, then I think it just raises wonderful possibilities for how much nicer the cities can be, and the quality of life, and that translates into equity too. So certainly, as I'm a big fan of gardens and botanical gardens and man-made improvements to nature, and these things are what a wealthy country does tend to put their resources into, and that will only make it so much more attractive and desirable to be in so many different kinds of urban environments. And I think offers, designers will drool about the opportunity to help make that happen, and also do so with ESG as a major focal point. I just might put in on a tiny bit of PR. Harvard is in the process of creating a new real estate degree, which is a big thing. Many other universities have a real estate degree, a formal degree. While we've had a real estate program since I got to Harvard, and even before, it is not it's not a degree with real estate in the name. And as that happens, I think it's going to frankly, help raise the profile of real estate in the academy. And ESG is a very central, crucial part of our getting the program established. So what that means, I think, in the long run is you'll have more owners who are concerned and focused on ESG. And I think more, it's not just on the real estate side, it's in the whole DNA of the academy now. So these issues, environment's been up there for quite a long time, but governance and social, I think, have not had their day in the sun as much as the environment has. And going forward, that's changing.
Well, Rick, this has just been such a fantastic conversation. I wish we had more time. We're going to run out now, but I'm hoping that you and we could put a comma on this and come back to it sometime. The work that Harvard is doing altogether through its real estate program that you've led for years, and that sounds like a new degree program, might be something we want to pick up and talk about. We've got to move beyond concept to action. Yeah. It's time for us to figure out how do we use our collective set of relationships and influence to bring together everyone, and let's get some real decisions made. I grew up in South Texas, and there was an old fellow that worked for my dad that used to say when you needed to make a big decision, he would say, let's get all the liars in a room and lock the door. And, and we need to get everybody together and lock the door and come up with what can we help this industry, our governments, to make more informed, clarified decisions toward advancing the agenda of the United States, advancing the agenda of the people of the United States, so that we can get to this a new ground of social equity, of tremendous healthiness, and that new front of mind awareness that we have coming through this pandemic, and of course, dealing with it beyond greenwash. Yes. To the reality of our environmental challenges that we have in the future. So I just want to say thank you again for joining me, and we'll look forward to doing this again sometime.
Well, thank you, Dave. You've raised a lot of the most complex and important questions, and it's a pleasure to at least have the opportunity to share my thoughts.
Thank you.